Here we played from the beginning to measure 15. Now, remember you're in the key of G major, you have an F sharp, which means you have a high 2 on your D string and a low 2 on your A string. Now there are a couple of tricky rhythms. In measure 8, you have a rest on beat 1, and then an up bow slur for beats 2, 3, and 4. It's going to look like this. Rest. One more time. Rest. And then in measure 13, you have a rest on beat 1, a quarter note, and then a half note. So you need to make sure you're counting there. Rest. And then you have something very similar in measure 14, just without the rest. So, playing through measures 13 and 14, it's going to look like this. Rest. So here we played from measure 15 to measure 23. Now there are a few rhythmically tricky places in this section. For example, measure 17 and measure 21, you have a note on beat 1, 2 rests, and then a note on beat 4. You need to make sure you're counting both those rests. So measure 17, for example, should sound like this. Rest, rest. The other rhythmically tricky places are places with dotted half notes. Now remember, a dotted half note is worth 3 beats, so you need to make sure you're counting all 3 beats. Measure 18, for example, should sound like this. 1, 2, 3. And then measure 22 is the same thing. 1, 2, 3, rest. Make sure it lasts all 3 beats. So here we played from measure 26 to measure 37. Now this part is very similar to the beginning. You're going to see a lot of the same ideas, the same themes. Make sure you're playing all of your slurs. The trickiest parts are going to be measure 26, the very beginning. You have a rest on beat 1, and then a quarter note and 2 quarter notes slurred. So that's going to sound like this. Rest. You really need to make sure that rest is there. And then something very similar happens in measure 34. You have a rest and then 3 notes slurred upwards. So, rest. Make sure those notes are all up bows. Rest. Here we played measure 37 to measure 43. The tricky part in this section is making sure you have the right number of each notes. You have a G, and then 4 A's, 4 D's, 4 A's, and then 4 D's. You really need to count and make sure you have all of those notes or you're going to get off. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of each. Okay, and then measure 41, you have a note on beat 1 and then 3 beats of rest. You need to make sure all 3 beats are there and you don't skip any rests. 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure those last 2 notes start on a down bow and then an up bow. So here we played measure 43 to 53. The most tricky part of this section is that you have a first and second ending at the repeat. So the first time you play 43, you play the first ending, and then the second time you play 43, you skip the first ending and just play the second ending. The other difficult part is the rhythm. You really need to make sure you're counting your eighth notes. For example, the first two measures, it's 1 and 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and. It's not the same every time, so make sure you're playing the eighth notes in the right place. And then, in measure 46, you have another dotted half note. Those are 3 beats long. Make sure you're playing all 3 beats and then have a nice solid rest on beat 4. Rest. So this section starts out pizzicato. Make sure not to play that with your bow. You need to make sure you're plucking it. In measure 56, you have 3 whole beats of rest to get your bow ready for arco. So make sure you have your bow in your hand ready to go. 56 to 57 should look and sound like this. Rest, rest, rest. Make sure you're not crashing your bow on the string. It should be quiet as a ninja. So, 1, 2, 3, 4.